Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Victor Hanson, who's a farmer, classicist, and military historian. He is a professor of classics at California State University at Fresno and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He writes a column for the National Review Online and contributes regularly to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, among other publications. His books include Ripples of Battle, The Soul of Battle, The Western Way of War, Who Killed Homer, and An Autumn of War. Victor, welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born right where I am right now, a little rural hospital 15 miles southwest of Fresno. And I live in the same house that my great-great-grandmother built, so my children are sixth generation to still live there.
And it's a farming family.
It is. It was always a farming family, and I farmed for a number of years, and I still own some of the land. It was divided up recently when my parents died, but there's still 60 acres of the original 180 I own.
And what did the land produce when it was?
Raisins and tree fruit. Mm-hmm. So my brother and I and my cousin from 1980 to 86 or 7, and then they continue to farm. They just sort of quit last year.
Mm-hmm. And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, I was very lucky. I had very wonderful parents. My father and my mother was a Stanford Law School graduate. My father was a University Pacific master's degree graduate, and my mother was a judge and my father was an administrator, but they lived on this farm, so they gave us these sort of antithetical messages. One was, don't think you're better than anybody else, you have to get your hands dirty, you have to work on the ranch, but education is the only hope, both practically and spiritually. So it's been both a gift and a burden to be attached to this piece of land. You can't really leave it, and you feel guilty when you're away, but it's advantages as well.
But you never forget hard work, hard manual labor, I guess, in that kind of enterprise.
No, my mother, as I said, I used to go over with her. She was a leading justice in Central California, and she would go with me at 62 and sell plums and peaches at the Santa Cruz Farmers Market, which we used to do. So that was the idea, that there had to be a balance between the physical and the abstract.
Where did you do your undergraduate work?
Well, they just opened UC Santa Cruz, and my father said, this is the closest UC, and I don't want you to go to Fresno State. And I had an older brother there, and so I had a twin brother, and said, all three of you can go there, and we'll buy a house. And we saw one for $25,000 that had a payment of $150 a month. And so the three of us moved in, and we rented out 2 rooms, and that paid for our education.
Very good. Those were the days.
Those were the days.
Yeah. And what led you to classics? Why did you choose that as a field? Was that in graduate school or already as a...
No. It was very funny. I grew up this rural high school, and I took as many advanced placement tests as I could, and I didn't really know what they were. So when I graduated, I realized I had 2.5 years of college credit. So when I got over to UC Santa Cruz, what happened was I didn't have to take any classes that I didn't want to. And there was this student upheaval was just ending. It was 1971. And there were these wonderful classes from these Ivy League professors in Greek and Latin. So I just started to take them my freshman year. And I didn't have to take a GE. And the next thing I knew, I took 4 years of very narrow Latin and Greek language and literature. And about halfway through that course of study, they advised me if I continued, I could go to graduate school. And the idea that somebody would pay me was new to me, so I did it.
And so then you went to graduate school at Stanford?
Yeah, at Stanford and a PhD. And as I was doing this, I'm not being just practical, the message from Greek literature, Euripides, and Homer and Sophocles and Thucydides was tragic and practical, and it wasn't the message that I was getting from contemporary American society, so it was almost a refuge of sorts.
Mm-hmm. And what did you do your dissertation on?
Well, it was a philologically based program, so everybody was supposed to be a textual critic, and I did not want to reestablish the text for the 100th time of a particular author. So I wanted to study war and I grew up on a farm, and I had a thesis advisor who had just arrived and said, why don't you just study war during agricultural devastation of the Attic countryside during the Peloponnesian War. And I did, and as a sort of penance, I had to have the first chapter, a philological study of all the Greek words for ravaging. Mm-hmm. And UC asked me to come out with it, and I came out in 1998 with a new edition.
Mm-hmm. And that book is the Western Way of War.
No, actually, it's called Warfare and Agriculture.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay.
And then I edited a book called Hoplites, and then I wrote The Western Way of War.
Later. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And now, so what is evolving here as you make this journey is an interest in classics, a real knowledge of farming and so on, but also an interest in war. I get the sense that recollections of war from family members who had been lost as soldiers, or, for example, your father who had served in World War II. Tell us how that...
Well, I was growing up in this rural family, and at Thanksgiving or dinner or every day there was, at one end of the table was my grandfather Frank, who was gassed in the Argonne in 1918, and he had trouble breathing. And then my father was next to him, and he had flown 39 missions in a B-29 over Tokyo, and then they would talk about Victor, who I was named after, who was killed on Okinawa. And then there was Vernon, who had been in the Aleutian campaign, and everybody there had certain attitudes about Europe, war, hard work, and that was sort of the frame of reference. But I was more bookish, I guess, so I would study the things they would tell me. I'd come back at dinner and say, you know, well, Dad, did you know on March 11th there was actually 742 B-29s? And so it was a mixture of first-hand recollection with abstract study.
But you were interested in it.
I was.
Yeah.
I was fascinated about human nature and conflict, and especially war as an arbiter. The ultimate disagreement is, and that sometimes it had a utility, that things were solved by war. Just as, and my parents made us go to school in a very rough neighborhood. It was about 75% of the people had just arrived from Mexico, and the public school system. So my father kept ingraining it in us that when you were at the local schools, it didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter how bright you were, it didn't matter you got straight A's, it didn't matter anything. And when you got out on the school ground, there would be people who would, all the things that made you a good person, good grades, following the rules, being polite, they would hate you for it because they would see that as weakness or arrogance, and that nobody would be there to help you, and that you had to not only protect yourself but try to help people who were not able to protect themselves. I think I got 100 lectures about bullies. So I had a lot of fights when I was very young, and I still live in the same neighborhood. My children had to go to the same schools, and they're much worse.
So you're suggesting that even as a young person, the ideas that you had about the world were tested by reality?
I think they were, because I saw a lot of things on the farm. Farming is the most dangerous of all occupations, and I saw people maimed. I saw it happens that my brother cut his finger off the other year, and that was constant injury, and then going to school were fights, and then trying to keep this farm was not, it was not suggested that this was an economic issue. People, my grandfather would say, we'll see if you can keep it the way I did. People will come and try to take it away from you. So they had a Hobbesian view that nothing was static. There were forces out there that always wanted to take things, and people who tried to stop them. And this was a tension in the world, and it would never end.
Was this background conducive, supportive to your focusing on Greek studies? I mean, as you went through this literature, as you mastered this material, I guess then it resonated with this experience, because the Greeks really did focus on agriculture and war.
I noticed a couple of things, that everything in classics that had been written about war was written mostly in German in the 19th century, and had very wonderful things that was discredited because of Germany's later performance in World War II and World War I even. And then nobody had written anything about agriculture. So because they didn't have any practical. And as I started to investigate it, I realized that Greece is about in the same latitude that I grew up at. It was a Mediterranean climate. I knew a lot about vines and wheat and olive trees. I was interested in war, and the field was wide open. So I remember going back to one of the advisors at Stanford and saying, there's not one title in the card catalog with the word agriculture in association with ancient Greece since 1922, because that was trying to override their skepticism about studying that.
And when you left Stanford, you went back to farming, though. You didn't practice your classics right away.
No, I finished pretty quickly, and I lived in Greece for 2 years doing the archaeological part of the research. And I came back in 1980, and I had a brother who had dropped out of medical school, and another brother who was working with and my grandparents had passed away. My parents were living in Fresno, and the question was, if somebody doesn't run this ranch, we're going to have to sell it. So the three of us ran it, and we did a lot. It had fallen in decay during my grandfather's later years, so we put a new irrigation system, we built sheds, we redid it, and by 1985, unfortunately, that was right during the agricultural collapse. So I went and got a job. I was lucky enough there was a university within commuting distance. The good news, the bad news was they never had a classics program. It was very hard to convince them they should be teaching Latin and Greek at Fresno State.
And so you really established a program there,
I did.
right?
There was nothing there. I started off as a part-time Latin teacher. And the next year I offered Latin and Greek, and I taught 5 classes a semester for probably 8 years. And then I was lucky I hired more colleagues, and now we have 4 people. And it's a very good program.
But over time, you became disillusioned with the study of classics generally in the United States. And in fact, you even wrote a book with a co-author called Who Killed Homer, I believe, which I can show.
Yes.
Yeah.
John Heath was a student I had met at Stanford, and he had started the same thing that I had done, only in Florida. And we had talked over the years about why it was that all the values that reflected Greek values, egalitarianism, education, practicality, pragmatism, and were not being honored by the profession. In other words, it was becoming highly theoretical. The key was not to teach. It was to publish for narrower and narrower audiences. It was not to use the clarity of the expression the Greeks had embraced. And it was careerist. So we wrote sort of a diatribe or a critique about the profession and why such a wonderful thing as classics was down to 600 majors a year and I think 4,000 classicists.
Throughout the country.
Yeah, and it had in that tiny world of classics, it had an earth-shattering effect, if you could say that, because we quoted research, we quoted what people wrote, and that people became hysterically angry because the world really hadn't paid any attention to classics, but now it was being discussed in larger venues, and the only message that was getting out was our message. And they didn't think that was fair at all.
And why do the Greeks still matter? Because you were focusing on the Greeks at a time when one could say that nationally we were in a sense losing our commitment and understanding of what Western civilization meant.
A couple of reasons. Historically, there is no West before the Greeks. Even in Greece before the 7th century, you have the Dark Ages and the Mycenaeans are not Western in the sense as we know it. So this idea of what is consensual government, what's capitalism, what's freedom, what's individualism, what's secularism, all of these ideas were not only apparent in Greece, but they were discussed, the contradictions of them. Is it good to have democracy? Is it good to dumb culture down to the lowest denominator? Is it good to have religion as a state religion or as a coercive mechanism to instill good behavior? All of these things that we wrestle with today were discussed by people who in some ways were not confused by technology. They were empirical. They just wrote down the world that they saw. So I thought that message had been lost. And then they had this, as I said, tragic view of the world, that we all die, we all grow old, and it wasn't old age is the golden years, or it wasn't, isn't this wonderful that, you know, if you have a divorce or you have a death in the family, maybe we can learn from this. No, it was bad. Mm-hmm. And so there was an honesty in expression. Mm-hmm. And a appreciation of how tenuous life was, mm-hmm. and how appreciative you should be to have shelter and food.
Now over these years, you were also focusing on being a military historian, and the Greeks had a lot to tell us about war that we were losing sight of in this post-Vietnam era.
Yeah, I think what happened was that military history as a discipline was discredited after Vietnam. And there was a few people, John Keegan in England surely was one, that wanted to look at it as a social, cultural phenomenon, and I did. And so I wrote a series of books that tried to suggest that this is the way that Westerners fight. It's predicated on cultural and political assumptions. This is how it relates to society. And it's amoral in the sense that war itself is not bad. It's the war, particular wars are good or bad, and I tried to establish criteria for them. So I wrote a series of books in comparative military history. And it was a lot of work because I had to go to Civil War or the Ottomans, and I went beyond classics.
And one of your major books was a book called The Western Way of War. And tell us about what you found there. And I believe I read somewhere that one of the things that led you, that struck you as you were getting into these studies, were there were notions about destruction of Greek farmland in warfare that didn't make sense to you because you were a farmer.
There had been the standard opinion was that armies went in, a historian like Thucydides or Polybius would say, they ravaged the land and they were trying to starve the enemy out. But there were problems. When I re-examined that, I would see things like they came every year. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, if they cut down all the olive trees, there'd be no need for that. And then growing up on a farm, I noticed it was very hard to cut down an olive tree. It's very hard, actually, to burn grain except for a brief window. So I realized that there were physical problems with doing it, and more importantly, I started to see the psychological ramifications, that it was a catalyst to insult the pride, to instill anger. And from that germ, I began to reread Greek literature for the first time and ask wider questions. Why do people go to war? And is it always because of materialism? This is very unpopular because at this time in classics, Moses Finley and other people were talking in very Marxist terms about material reasons, and the idea that it could be, in the Greeks' way, psychological or spiritual, and about honor and fear and envy and jealousy was considered kind of crazy.
And in The Western Way of War, you actually helped us understand what Greek warfare was like in this period from 700 BC
to 700 to 350 or 340.
To 340. And there was a real integration of the way of life of the soldier and the kind of war they fought and the way it was fought. Tell us a little about that.
Well, it was in the Mediterranean climate, so there was a campaigning season that was predicated on the agricultural year. You were a farmer and a militiaman, so you had your own responsibilities back home on the farm, and so you couldn't be away from your farm very long. So usually it was a consensual government. They had to have a majority vote. So usually these two sides would meet by, I guess, convention. They would meet in a flat plain. They'd put on this absurd heavy armor because they had like purposes. They'd crash together, and then there'd be an artificial understanding that the one who won would establish a trophy, and then the question would be resolved. Usually it was pretty worthless borderland. And then as this got going, people began to realize that it was both economical but absurd, because one army might have reserves, or one army might have a big navy, or one Athens might have light armed troops, or might not. So it was kind of artificial, especially when you met the Persians. and you saw that this was a whole different challenge. So I was very interested in how this system unwound and the social ramifications of letting people fight who didn't own land, who weren't citizens, who were former slaves. The question of utility versus efficacy or honor, and it was very interesting for me.
And was there a corruption of the political system that had worked so well, you know, in this earlier period?
There was, and there was also an honesty to it. It starts actually with Athens, that democracy that was not a landed oligarchy. And I guess I could sum it up by saying, who are you farmers to decide that the whole city-state should rest or fall within 1 hour's ceremonial collision when we have other assets like walls that we can hide behind the walls, or we don't have to come out and fight, or we can fight at night, or we can poison the water, or we can fight at sea, or we can fight with arrows. So you had all this literature from Homer onward criticizing the slave, criticizing the bowman, criticizing the spear thrower, javelin thrower. And what was interesting is the more warfare became democratic and was not predicated on social class, the more destructive it became and the more amoral it came.
But in this earlier period, there was a movement toward a decisive, finite war, which was very nasty, but which put an end to the matter.
Yes, I think that was important because that idea, even though it was no longer an infantry battle, survived in Greek thinking. That if you had a sea battle, the point was to destroy the enemy's assets. And this is important because there's a lot of other traditions, the nomadic tradition or the Chinese tradition or the tradition in Latin America of ceremonial wars, of hostage taking, of anthropological explanations for it, cattle raiding, but never, or fighting a war where you are the indirect approach. But the idea that when war is declared, you find the enemy's military forces, you find the quickest way to get there and destroy them and get home is very familiar to us in America today even.
As a military historian, I want you to help us understand what a military historian does. I mean, what sort of problems interest you?
Well, the discipline of military history has clear-cut rubrics or subdivisions. There's logistics, there's grand strategy, there's tactics, there's what we call operational history about how divisions fight battalions or how horsemen fight. And then there's sort of economic, social military history, gender, race, class, as it pertains to war. And all of these are traditional military history. As military history came into its own, it seemed to me that operational history, tactical history, strategy, and especially the experience of what it was like to fight sort of were pushed away. And we saw military history to be acceptable had to be social history. So what I was trying to do was to bring back question of tactics, strategy, and the face of battle, to use John Keegan's term, back into the mainstream and do it in a different way so that I wasn't seen as just a Prussian military officer, but seen as something that strategy or tactics or the experience of battle rippled out, or it affected communities, or it was not just an esoteric science.
One of your recent books, which I think I have here, is Ripples of Battle. Yeah. And let's talk a little about that as a kind of a case study. And you focus on three battles important in history. And you really begin this exercise with a quote from Churchill: "Great battles change the entire course of events, create new standards of values, new moods in armies and in nations." So this ripple effect, and in this book, one of the battles you focus on is Okinawa, and the story you're telling there has really ripple effects within World War II, beyond World War II, but also among families, your own families.
I was trying to show that there was something abnormal about a battle. You put a bunch of mostly young men throughout history in a confined space, in a confined time, and the stakes are one's life. They see ghastly things, and those impressions then affect them for their long span of life in a way that maybe even getting married or having children or farming or buying your first car do not. And that a lot of literature and drama and philosophy come out of that. So I wanted to make that argument first. And it's not predicated just on numbers of dead. I mean, plague and earthquake kill people much more than wars do sometimes. But they don't involve these issues like culpability or preventability or human agency. So I wanted to look at three of them, a modern one at Okinawa, a one at Shiloh, and then a Greek battle at Delium, to show that the same issues were constant throughout time and space. And in the case of Okinawa, I had grown up with hearing about how this battle had killed this young Swedish-American farmer, farm kid at 23, just after he got his bachelor's degree in 1945. And nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody knew exactly how and they were all dead now. So I wanted to, as a personal odyssey, reconstruct and explain how that death had affected all these people I know, but then lead that as an entry into the battle itself.
And this was your namesake. The person you're named after him was a cousin.
It was my father's first cousin. His mother died in childbirth, and his father sort of left. So he grew up with my father, and they were the same age, same height, looked almost identical, and they had joined the Marine Corps together. And they had gotten in a fight with an officer, and as punishment, my father took the rap and they put him in these new experimental B-29s, which turned out to save his life. And to stay in the 6th Marine Division was, if you look at the casualty ratios on Okinawa of the 29th Marines, it was a death sentence. Nobody knew that at the time. So I was interested in how he died. I knew that it would be almost impossible because 83% of his battalion that went up Sugarloaf Hill was dead by the time he died. And this being 58 years, I didn't think there'd be anybody alive, but I found actually 7 people who were there when he died.
And the battle over Okinawa occurs toward the end of the Pacific War. It's a major island right near Japan. Over 90 days, the Japanese lost probably 100,000. We lost 12,000 soldiers, maybe another 100,000 civilians were killed. So it was a really horrendous battle to take a well-fortified island, and the costs and casualties were really quite heavy, but it was important for moving on to Japan.
I think it was. It was the idea that it was a funny battle, that it was started on April 1st, and it was ended July 2nd, and then 60 days later the war was over. So the American people woke up, and they really didn't know what was going on for 2 reasons. One, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died right at the beginning of the battle, and then Europe was liberated and the war was over in early May. So while their attention was focused on Europe, they didn't realize there would be 50,000 casualties, 350 ships hit, 5,000 sailors killed, 7,000 Marines and Air Force. This worst fighting of the entire war. In fact, there were days where Okinawa was the worst day for the Americans in World War II. So that was striking. And then what was even more striking is what the purpose of it was. It was to get a gigantic island 350 miles from the Japanese mainland. And while we today worry about the atomic bomb, we have no idea what Curtis LeMay was thinking of. Bring in the 3,000 B-29s, and rather than having to fly 1,500 miles from the Marianas, they could fly 3 sorties a day. And although they'd almost burned down the cities of Japan already, they could do this day in. And then why not bring all the B-17s in, and even the B-24s, and even the Lancasters. And his mad mind, he had this idea of 15,000 bombers, 350 miles from Japan. It would have been a Holocaust. And I tried to discuss that. And then also, we worry about the bomb and the moral implications of that, but
the dropping of the atomic bomb,
in August. But we have completely forgotten that generation asked different questions, and that was, we killed over 100,000 Japanese soldiers. They and us together killed 100,000 Okinawans, and then we had 50,000 American casualties. And when this was all going on, we had a bomb that was almost ready for production. It was tested in July. So why didn't we just hold off and use this bomb, and then we wouldn't have had to have all these people dead? So that generation's call was not, don't use the bomb, but use it earlier. And then it had an enormous effect on what we envisioned for Japan, because there were suicide boats, there were suicide submarines, there were suicide battleships, the Yamato, and there was suicide, of course, planes, there was suicide corpses, and the Americans had never ever experienced anything like that. It made Iwo Jima look like a picnic, if I could say that. And the idea that there was still 12,000 kamikaze planes on the Japanese mainland, and there was a militia of 5 million people, it would be staggering to see Okinawa replicated at a magnitude of, say, 10 or 20.
So this really impacted on the decision about the atomic.
You can't understand the dropping of the atomic bomb unless you read about what went on in Okinawa and what the Japanese militarists said. I mean, they had written instructions that one man can take 10 out or take a tank, and they'd had a year to fortify the island, and it was designed by the Japanese to show the Americans that we can make life so horrible for you, and you can't take casualties like we can, that you better think about a negotiated surrender of ours rather than unconditional surrender. And the militarists could stay in power with the threat that if you try to invade the mainland, it'll be another Okinawa. And they were successful in that way.
So in a way, this is a first run for what we're now encountering in terms of suicide bombers in the Middle East.
Yeah, it is, because for two reasons. One, the tactic of putting a man in a plane and trying to blow up things, or a person on the ground trying to do it. And more importantly, the whole idea that a Western affluent bourgeoisie society cannot suffer the same degree of casualties as a militaristic society. So make war so terrible that even though we lose 10 times more than you do, your loss is felt more grievously. The only thing I can't quite understand about the Islamic fundamentalists who are terrorists, that they didn't really learn the lessons, as we saw the other day in Fallujah, that the West always has a response to this. Now, it may be horrific, but it will draw on its capital, its technology, its discipline to come up with a remedy. And the only thing that stops the full implementation of that remedy is usually a sense of self or moral restraint. And something about suicide bombing is a liberating experience for a Westerner. When they encounter suicide bombing, it's almost as if these people are going to do this to us, then there's no other way to win the war but to unleash the dogs of American militarism. And that's what we did. And we'll probably do it again if it happens again.
And you write that the pool of those who wish to kill themselves in service to a lost cause is finite, despite professed fanaticism.
Yeah, it's so funny that we had this idea that there was every Japanese person wanted to be a kamikaze. In fact, there was about 7,000 people that did, and most Japanese hated the tactic. And after the war, the people who had inaugurated the tactic were despised. They had to finally get people out of the universities who were English majors, of all things. They had to intoxicate people. Today it's kind of nostalgic, and even Japanese people look back in glory, but not at the time, and there was a finite number. And the final kamikazes, the biggest problem was in the latter days of the campaign, they were not flying their missions, and the fighters who went along with them were instructed to shoot them down if they don't go. And I think you're seeing the same thing after 3 years in the West Bank, that if you start looking at the profile of suicide bombers, we're seeing a lot of people now who are under psychiatric help, who are in a messy divorce that's impugning the honor, that are caught with adultery. And so there is a finite number, whether it's in Japan or the present-day West Bank, who are willing to do that. And if the West or whoever is against suicide bombing, because it doesn't seem to be a Western phenomenon, if they're willing to recognize that and to put up deterrence and to wait it out and then to use its own advantages in a counterattack, it's not successful.
Before we talk about 9/11 and its impact on the United States, I want to ask you, in doing this research on Okinawa for this book, you actually found someone who sent you a memo.
Yeah, I was talking to a lot of these people about how Victor Hanson was killed, and one of the funny things was one of them said, well, didn't you get my letter? Well, his letter was sent in 1945, so I went out and found an old letter in my grandfather's, but he sent me a copy of it. Now he's 87, and he was 30. And then another one said, well, why didn't anybody call me when I had Victor's ring? And I said, what ring? And he said, well, you know, he was so proud of this Legionnaire ring that he wore in training at Guadalcanal. And I said, no. And he said, well, he had a premonition he might die, and he wanted us to take it back. I said, well, what would he do? He didn't know classics. He said, no, but he had a Roman Legionnaire, and I was a classicist, so I was interested, and him as well. And then he muffled, and he said, let me go away from the phone, I'll call you back. He called me back a little bit later and said, I have it here. And I remember now that I called your grandfather, and he didn't speak English well, and he didn't want to come to the phone. And I have it, and I'll mail it to you. Well, I didn't know whether it was age or senility, but sure enough, this thing came, and then I had pictures of him, and you could see it on his finger, and so they had cut it off when he brought down, he was bloated the next day, and they'd cut it off his finger. So it came in the mail, and I put it on this, so here it is.
So this is almost Greek or mystical.
It is, for me it is, yeah. And I wear it around my neck 24 hours a day.
And that history would bring you back to the personal, really.
It is. It made it. I remember the name. Of course, I never met him, but when I went to school, my father went out to the barn and said, here's his briefcase, here's his baseball bat, here's his papers. Now, your job is, I don't want to talk to you about it, I don't want to know anything about it. He couldn't talk about it. He just said, you're supposed to be a better person. Well, growing up in this small rural community, every time I went to the doctor, there'd be a very attractive nurse in the 50s, or he dated and said, I was in love with Victor Hanson, or I'd go meet some guy, you know, this guy was 6'2", you're only 6'1", you know. He spoke Swedish, you don't speak a word, that kind of stuff. My whole life I was haunted by him, and a wonderful person.
Let's talk a little now about 9/11. Did the 9/11 attack in some funny kind of way bring us back to the Greeks and what they had to tell us?
I think so. I think most people had thought that we were sort of at the end of history, that globalization or westernization had created a uniformly affluent, interconnected world, and that in the United States during the 90s we had a booming economy. We were sort of like a dog that was asleep, and every time we hear these strange places like Khobar Towers or Tanzania or First World Trade or USS Cole, it was kind of swatting a fly. And the idea was almost, well, they're military people or they're diplomats, they can harvest a few, that's not serious. And then suddenly the worst attack on America as a precursor to war in our history, more than Lexington, Concord, Sumner, Havana Bay, Pearl Harbor, it really shook us up. And then the question is, what are you going to do about it? Well, we talked about a coalition government in Afghanistan. We talked about Pakistani UN peacekeepers. And suddenly, out of the past, we started to hear voices that would say, no, these people want to kill you, and they're going to keep killing you, and you stop it. Now, either stop them or give up. And there were a majority, not a great majority, but there were a majority of people in the United States, I think, understood that in a way that maybe Europe didn't.
You wrote, awful men cannot be cajoled, bought off, counseled, reasoned with, or reported to the authorities, but rather must be hit and knocked hard to cease their evil doing if the blameless and vulnerable are to survive.
Well, I think the point that we should keep in mind with all this is that there were thousands of Afghans that were killed, hung, tortured. The whole species of, half of our species, all the women in Afghanistan were relegated to medieval status. And same thing in Iraq. And every time some Westerner has embraced utopianism and the idealism of reason as the ultimate arbiter of disagreement. Somebody else, less affluent, less privileged, pays for it with his life. So actually the use of force, if it's done in a legitimate way and it's done carefully and it's thought out, can save far more lives than will be lost. And I was just appalled when I heard people in the United States, make these predictions of millions of people would die in Afghanistan. And the United States is culpable when we had watched this horrific regime destroy an entire country and had done nothing about it. And finally, when we woke up belatedly and were doing something about it, people didn't understand.
One of the ideas that had developed, after the Vietnam War was the notion, well, we really, as a democracy, couldn't allow one American soldier to be killed. I mean, if we lost one soldier, that the politicians had to run for cover because the people would turn them out. I would like for you to talk a little about the synergy between democracy and war, because the fact of the matter is it often can cut the other way. In other words, that when you have a functioning democracy that confronts a situation like 9/11, that not only can it marshal the technology and the resources, but it can really rally forces for a war against the adversary.
There's a pro and a con about democracy at war, and it's sort of discussed at length in Thucydides' history, especially of the Sicilian campaign. That's one place. Polybius talks about it in association with Rome. And in times of peace, because of the success of the rule of law, and usually there's a better economy than democracy than a non-democracy. Life is pretty good, and because people run their own government, they have a tendency to vote themselves entitlements, and B, try to avoid risk that any one person. And that can be fatal, as we saw in France in 1940, or we saw in Athens in 340 BC when they were threatened by Philip. That being said, if a democracy wakes up and is attacked and mobilizes all of its resources and has a majority vote, there's no ultimate appeal, no second guessing. You don't say, Franco made us do this. It wasn't me, it was Hitler. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. No, the democracy, the people themselves have a stake in it, and they're constantly auditing the conduct of the war. And the ultimate check on that is their own sense of fairness. So if you attack a democracy and you kill a lot of people in a democracy, human nature being what it is, they're going to vote to take reprisals. And democracies, when they're aroused, make war like no other type of government.
I get the sense that from your writings after 9/11 that the other thing that resulted from the battle of that day when we were attacked was that we had to rethink or be reminded of what it is we stand for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what has happened to us since Vietnam is that because of our success, whether it's civil rights or the environment or equality of the sexes, that we have created even increased appetites for greater success. If we once wanted to ensure an equality of opportunity, with freedom and liberty being the objects for everybody, now we want is almost an equality of results. Egalitarianism and equality were more important. And that is hard to do. Human nature, again, to use that hackneyed phrase, telling us that we're not all born into this world equally, and to, by coercion, make us equal. And once you have that mentality, and you have a vibrant economy, and you have a leisured society, then you can lose touch with reality very quickly. And we have this hypercriticism that if we're not utopian, we're not perfect, then we're utter failures. So immediately after 9/11, there were people whose voices we heard. Well, wasn't Afghanistan part of the British Empire? And it was either cultural pessimism, the peaks are too high, the Northern Alliance is unreliable, we didn't have our hands clean, the British never won, the Russians never won. So it was either pessimism in the thought, or it was sort of hyper-criticism of, well, didn't we withdraw after we got the Soviets out? And didn't somebody give aid to Osama bin Laden? Without any knowledge that that's the stuff of history, that nobody in 1944 would say, well, wait a minute, we gave 375,000 GMC trucks to Stalin. We gave him probably 30,000 P-39 Air Cobras. And this was a man who butchered 30 million of his own people. And we used him cynically to fight the Nazis. No, they didn't think like that. They said, for now, at this time, in this place, Hitler is worse. When Hitler's gone, we'll turn our attention to Stalin. But we're not going to judge ourselves tainted or fouled because we're helping people who are mass murderers to kill a greater mass murder. And that's, it's important that Americans get out of their cocoon and wake up and realize that they don't have the ability to demand or achieve perfection, not in this world.
And you really believe that we do confront a clash of civilizations?
Oh, I do. What I am absolutely astounded by is the clear-cut clash of civilizations. We're talking about a group, a minority group, of perhaps 1 to 3 million people of the larger Middle East who are Islamic fundamentalists, and all of the Western tradition and liberalism they hate. Take your pick. Homosexuals, kill them. Women, no rights. Polygamy, clitorectomy, consensual government, no. Tolerance for Jews and Christians, no. Hindus, no. Buddhists, no. Patriarch, absolutely. And how are they successful? Because whether it was colonialism or anti-communism or realpolitik or just endemic tribalism, the Middle East is not with it. And so when it can't feed its people, it can't house them, it can't educate them, and it won't make these reforms, they turn their animus, their frustration, and their state-controlled media to America and the Jews, and the conduit from the frustration to the media is often these Islamicists. And the only way to rectify that is to defeat them and to humiliate them and to offer the people who follow them an alternative and get away from supporting the Saudi royal family or the Kuwaiti royal family and try to do something that would lead to integration within a larger world community, as we have done in Latin America and Asia.
Now, do you think that the United States, with the erosion of values that had occurred, in the last couple of decades, is it able to muster the wherewithal to engage in this conflict and succeed? I mean, I know we have the military resources, and we have a very talented and trained military that can win the military victory. The question is, can we stay for the long war, in the context of what we've become at home because of affluence and all other sorts of
I think
phenomena?
we can, but to be frank with you, if it's a question of New York and Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle winning this war, I don't think we can. But there are people who get up in the morning and they go wait tables, or they drive a tractor, or they go pick up a criminal, and they live in a real world, and they understand that there's a thin line between civilization and barbarism. And they've seen Saddam Hussein and they've seen Osama bin Laden in their own world, and they have no compunction about eliminating him. And they're just driving up today to talk to you. NPR had a man was just killed, 41 years old, Army major, left his 6-year-old son. He was a surgeon. He just emailed his parents that he would, on his time off from battle surgery, he was doing free appendectomies for Iraqis, and they blew him up and killed him, murdered him. They knew that he was there not to take their oil. They knew he was there to try to institute a liberal regime. And to listen to his parents, did they want to sue the government? They were from rural Wisconsin. No. Did they blame the military? No. What did they say? They said the world lost a wonderful person. The United States lost a great patriot. He had no regrets. He knew what he was doing. It's a tragedy. And that is sort of what America was all about, I think. But you wouldn't hear that in many places. So we're in a war of the hearts and minds for America. We'll see how many Americans are confident and proud of what the United States is, and how many are ashamed of it and think it's the source of evil in the world today. And if the latter group is larger, then we'll lose, and like every other society that sort of eroded and drifted away.
And what is the challenge of leadership, that is American leadership, in the context of this dilemma?
You can see with the president. The president is very, very good. It reminds me of Archilochus's metaphor of the fox and the hedgehog. Bill Clinton could think of 1,000 things and express himself wonderfully and not come to a decision. Bush is not glib. He's not sophisticated. He sees right and wrong, and that's what you need in war. The only problem that I have is that he needs to remind America this is not about weapons of mass destruction. This is not about the world's oil supply. This is not just about 9/11. This is a war with a type of enemy who, if its agenda was realized, would end all the things that we think are dear. And he needs to remind the American people that the Japanese like to import oil so that the world can have Hondas, or a Toyota Prius is trying to deal with the environment. The Europeans like to trade and sell farm equipment to the Middle East. There is a sophisticated world. People like to go study at Harvard from Jordan. That whole system is based on certain trusts, certain protections that these people, these terrorists and Islamists, would destroy, as we see in Spain, as we see in Turkey, as we see in Morocco. This is the face of barbarism, and they'll either win or it'll lose.
And so how, obviously, part of the problem here is to win a military victory. But beyond that, how do you win the battle of ideas?
Well, I think we should give ourselves some credit. We realize can't be won with ideas, and it can't be won with force. It has to be won with both. So militarily, we're going to defeat autocratic, fascistic governments, either now or in the past, that have sponsored, aided, abetted terrorists. At the same time, we're offering them the carrot and saying, this is a new United States. Look at Panama, look at Milosevic, look at Taliban. We're not just, say, pump oil, keep out the Russians, Shah of Iran, Saudi royal family. We're doing something differently, and we're trying to spend blood and treasure to give you an alternative to bin Laden. And if you don't want it, you don't have to, but we're going to get rid of bin Laden, and we're going to get rid of what he stands for, and that's all we can do. We did it with the German people, we did it with the Japanese, we did it with less success in Korea, we did it with no success in Vietnam. But we're going to try to do it, and we'll give them the alternative.
Looking down the road, how would you advise students to prepare for the future, for this world that you're describing, in which some of what the Greeks taught us really helps us understand that world, and virtues like character and courage and so on matter? How should they prepare for that world?
I think they should realize that the skills that make one successful in 500 BC may be the same today. It's not just adapting to a new technology or a new lifestyle. It's realizing that a new lifestyle or a new technology or a new computer is simply a manifestation of the human experience. But if you know language, you know history, you know argumentation, you can write well, then you can function in any new environment. And that's the only constant that can prepare you. And the same thing, if you come to class on time, if you turn a paper in on time, if you don't plagiarize, if you play by a particular convention or rule or law, then whatever change the situation, puts you in China, puts you in Hong Kong, the same principles of success and well-being will apply. What I'm worried about is what I'd call the sirens of presentism, that because you have 500 channels or you have a new desktop, then you've kind of faked yourself into believing that you don't have to write anymore, computers will do it. Or there's a situational ethics that is a new morality, or there's a moral equivalence. And you really see it in Afghanistan, where deliberately trying to blow somebody up in New York in a time of peace is the same as somebody dying when you're deliberately trying to avoid killing civilians and killing the people who kill people in Afghanistan. So we've got to watch that. This utopian pacifism, moral equivalence, multiculturalism, no appreciation for the uniqueness of your culture, and broad general education is what I would advise students.
On that note, Victor, I want to thank you for coming to the campus to lecture today and to be with us today and sharing with us this very fascinating intellectual journey. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.